Hello and welcome to today's program. Today's program is entitled Tool Up Key Strategies Supply Chain Managers Need to Know for Mitigating the Impact of COVID-19 on Global Trade and Managing the Recovery Process. For today's program, please be sure to ask questions throughout the entire event. You can use the Q&A tab or the chat function, and we will address all the questions during the program as it continues. I would like to introduce our speaker. We are very fortunate to again have Tom Cook as our speaker today. Tom has been speaking on global trade programs several times this year for our particular chapter, and I know for a lot of other associations. Tom is the CEO and Managing Director of Blue Tiger International, a premier international business consulting company on supply chain management, trade compliance, purchasing, global trade, and logistics. He was the former CEO of American River International in New York and Apex Global Logistics, supply chain operations in Los Angeles. Tom has over 30 years of experience in assessing companies all over the world managing their import and export operations. He is a member of the New York District Export Council, sits on the board of numerous corporations, and is considered a leader in the business verticals he works in. Tom is also the director of the National Institute of World Trade, a 30-year-old educational and training organization based in Long Island. At this time, I would like to welcome Tom to do our presentation for today.
Great. Thank you, Kathy, and thank you all for attending. As Kathy mentioned, is that I will take questions as the presentation is moving along, so you don't have to wait to the end. So we have a lot of topics to cover through the whole event that are outlined on this page here, but the real emphasis is really to talk about the impact to the global supply chain now that we're 8 months into this pandemic, evaluating the impact and framing the issues. And framing the issues becomes an important aspect of this because the next step, and as we close on this presentation, we're going to really share with you the recommendations and considerations that you should have for managing this impact and also the recovery process. But framing the issues allows us to justify and support the decisions that we make in providing advice and counsel. So I've had a long tenure with ISM. It actually goes back well now, over 25 years. We are a consulting company. We have 9 offices here in the United States, but we're based in New York. And we help companies manage their global supply chains. And our basic focus is to deal with risk and spend. So we do all kinds of assessments in the area of risk and spend and provide advice and counsel on how that could be minimized, mitigated, or business process improved. So I want to especially thank the ISM Denver and New Jersey, Ginger Young and Kathy Perna, for setting this event up, and my own organization, Ann Patterson and Lindsay Dinney. So we've been working in this segment of supply chain for now 35 years. And we have a stretch of resources around the world that is located in 50 gateways, meaning that we have boots on the ground in these various places. That's a critical factor here, because if we depend upon our various information flows and we depend upon mainly the media to provide us what's going on in the world, they kind of have their own agenda, and a lot of times it's slanted and biased. So having boots on the ground locally, we're actually getting a better idea of what's going on, which then allows us to give better information and better advice to our clients and people like yourselves in these type of webinars. So the issues with the pandemic that now we've been living with for almost 8 to 9 months is the panic and overaction and closing almost everything to do with supply chain. The difficulty to contain and spread, the devastating impact to individuals, businesses, and global trade in general, the consequences without symptoms, the global crisis, the difficulty to anticipate, plan, and implement in our responsibilities. And now we see very dramatically the politicization of the pandemic, not only here in the United States, but all over the world. And appreciate now the recent spikes that we've had in the United States, as well as a lot of different places around the world, have an impact, not only as us as individuals and our businesses, but in the actual running and responsibilities that we all have in procurement and in supply chain. So the ultimate consideration or concern here is that this circumstance of this pandemic has an impact directly to the supply chain. We need to evaluate that impact because we need to come up with recommendations on how we're going to manage ourselves in this pandemic. But one of the biggest challenges that we face relative to this subject matter is the uncertainty that it creates. And what is the consequence of uncertainty is trying to plan for events, activities, and handling our responsibilities. Uncertainty creates a direct impact on our risk. It causes hesitation, confusion, and dismay, and in making the right decision is directly impeded. Uncertainty and decision-making, and some of the examples that we look at, is just the problem of just trying to find new suppliers. Most of us that have a procurement or a purchasing responsibility, customer service responsibility, are constantly being visited by companies domestically and globally, trying to create sales of their product or service into our company. And that has come to a complete halt by the mid part of March and has been building up a little bit, but it's nowhere what it was before this pandemic occurred. A Northeast fabric supplier, a client of ours just recently, to manage this particular activity, ran a procurement event for one day where they invited in all kinds of companies from all over the world on a scheduled basis to come into their company, actually over a day and a half last month. So that would be an open event. They registered the people and made appointments, and they actually were able to see in a day and a half about 60 companies, of which about a third of them are brand new entities in their business model. Just another way of being creative and looking at how do we deal with the fact that people aren't traveling, particularly internationally. Trying to manage existing suppliers and trying to create KPIs that now refer to a pandemic where everybody is in this distressed circumstance and have limitations on their production, manufacturing, distribution, and supply chain resources. The ability to control pricing. In a survey that we did about 2 months ago, we almost got 100% response indicating the increase in pricing, both slowly and pretty dramatically in some cases, on various raw materials, parts, components, and finished products. The whole concept of trying to keep landed costs in control, meaning the accumulation of costs that are involved once we have an acquisition cost. We have something that's coming in as an import, the example of the air freight or ocean freight for it to come in, clearance charges, duties and taxes, and all the handling costs that are involved in moving it from point A to point B. Trying to maintain responsible inventory levels in our organization. How do you maintain responsible inventory levels when suppliers to us have difficulty in supplying, and that when we try to reach out to our customer base, they're having their own difficulty in telling us exactly what their needs are because the consumer demand is off in how they're projecting their anticipated sales. So the whole system has been disrupted, and managing inventory is one of the more difficult responsibilities that we face at this point in time. All demand planning models basically have gone through the window. Relationship building has become very difficult because most of the time in most large purchases, relationship has been built upon the factor of an eyeball to eyeball meeting where bonding takes place. You're breaking bread together, you're spending time together, getting to understand each other with an eyeball to eyeball contact. That's not happening to the same extent and the betterment of how it was happening previously in the current set of circumstances. Trying to hold suppliers accountable becomes more difficult when the whole circumstance is created in this difficult time. The internal needs that we all are dealing with the various silos in our companies pulling at us in sales, customer service, manufacturing, demand planning, and other silos that we interface with. A particular Northwestern tool manufacturer that we work with, because collaboration and communication is such a critical issue at this point in time, their procurement team and their supply chain team has 2 meetings every day, one at 10 o'clock in the morning and one at 3 o'clock in the afternoon for about 15 to 20 minutes, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page, because they're all working from home now. And the idea that walking into somebody's office or calling everybody into the conference room is not available, they kind of set that up on kind of a temporary basis. And it seems to have worked very well at keeping it as a team-based initiative and keeping everybody on the same page. Other considerations relative to uncertainty is the factor of collaboration over independent decision-making. We always have found that a lot of companies in their silos have somebody at the top makes all the decisions. But we have found that in this type of pandemic, that it's in a better situation to get collaboration from all the stakeholders, all the interested parties, all those personnel and silos that have vested interest in the transaction to participate in the decision-making process. We anticipate very well that a better approach to risk is looking at it conservatively at this point in time rather than liberally. Communication robustly in all directions, down the line to our suppliers and vendors, to the transportation infrastructure that supports that, and then outbound to our customers and the transportation infrastructure that supports that as well. And we need to anticipate better. Okay, it's much more critically important today than ever was in evaluating what our options are, the information flows, and creating SWOT analysis. Okay, the idea of looking at situations in a metric format, in an analytical, mathematical way. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but the idea of creating a SWOT analysis, looking at the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities and threats before we come down to a decision, which might be very impactful in terms of how our supply chains operate. Other things that come into play here is the impact of people working from home. I'm sure most of the people listening to this are working from their home. And the question is, how effective is that actually working? Is it not just a Band-Aid on the solution, or is it something that actually is making the company work even more effectively? In our survey that we did about a month ago, we determined that most people still question the effectiveness of people working from home, but we did find some companies that were extending this all the way into 2021 past the first quarter, as well as some companies looking at permanently having their people work from home because they feel how successful it is and reducing the cost, obviously, of brick and mortar. The disruption to the transportation and supplies infrastructure on goods and services coming to and from China, to and from Europe, and to and from the USA. Appreciate the fact that on the East and the West Coast is where the pandemic really had its first impact back in February, March, and April. Now it seems to be evenly spread throughout the entire country. We have a Southern-based uniform company that's a distributor. It's actually an importer of product that comes in from overseas, but they distribute it throughout the Western Hemisphere. They had a huge disruption to their supply chain, mainly due to the fact that the infrastructure did not have the capacity to handle their supply requirements. Okay, so we had to find various means of moving their products. And a lot of the product that came out of Asia, instead of moving it to the Gulf ports and the East Coast ports, we moved everything to the West Coast ports of California and Long Beach and Los Angeles, and in Port of Oakland and San Francisco, which allowed a much quicker transportation from overseas, and at the same time allowed for a very quick transit by train to the various distribution centers that they had in the United States. The inability to plan in both the context of short versus long-term business decision-making, and information constantly changing and proving to be unreliable, particularly in the first 5 months of this pandemic, where there was so much information out there that was turned out to be incorrect or wrong. And the circumstances hopefully has matured, where a lot of the information now is much more reliable than it was back up through June and July. Economic issues that come into play that we need to take into consideration here relative to supply chain is that panic addresses a lack of confidence. Confidence impacts the economy directly and indirectly. And every business sector is disrupted. Even the companies that are doing very well through this are disrupted because they have business volumes that are much greater than their ability to handle. And this lies specific to consumer industrial products, as well as the service sectors, and particularly with e-commerce versus retail. The e-commerce market is going through the roof because of the number of people who are working from home, and the factor that most things are not being delivered on this personal basis by the typical transportation modes. Now, the Postal Service, the FedExes, the UPS, the DHL is clearly handling the majority of these transits. And if you just look at the numbers for a company like Amazon, they're going through the roof because of the increase in e-commerce. And we know on the retail side that most of the major retailers are suffering in almost all of the locations, not only here in the United States, but all over the world. And we believe that the larger impacts of the pandemic really have not yet been felt yet tremendously. One is the inventory balances and replenishment. A lot of companies had significant inventory balances up through February, March, and they're now being expended. So replenishing those inventories has now become a more serious issue. Carriers' capacity is still a major problem internationally related to supply and demand. The demand is much greater than the supply of carrying capacity, both in the ocean and air freight mode. And appreciate the fact, very simply, if goods are not manufactured, distributed, sold, or purchased, the economies will continue to decline all over the world. Other issues relative to the economic situation is that the impact is not just here in the United States, but most of us that are involved in the international side of business, it's impactful all over the world. And there's a huge concern over the growing state of government deficits. It's not just here in the United States. Every country in the world is now in a deficit situation for the most part. The impact of the current recession, which is what we're actually in from an economic technical perspective, and the creeping face of inflation on consumer products, produce, healthcare, and other necessities, including basic utilities. In our survey that we did a month and a half ago, it came clear that everybody has advised that the utility pricing has gone up, electricity and water, gas and power, and just the normal purchases in the supermarket, they've seen a significant price increase for all types of produce, all types of meat products, and consumer items. And we all are conscious of the fact of the fiscal damage done to commercial real estate and the movement out of urban areas throughout the United States. The four big impacts are the shutdowns of businesses. Fortunately, businesses are starting to come back. There's actually been an uptick. The Department of Commerce has reported since the middle of August to the beginning of September, an uptick has actually occurred. But unfortunately, in other places around the world, particularly in Europe, that has not actually happened. We know that travel has eliminated almost completely. Most of the airlines will report numbers that they're 95 to 97% down on most trade lanes. And we believe that's likely to continue to the end of 2020 and all the way into the first quarter of 2021. The supply chain gets significantly disrupted. A lot of times the disruption, it comes from an indirect impact. I use the example of the tent distributor in the Midwest. The tent company purchased the tents, they're manufactured in China, but China requires certain chemicals to allow the product to be waterproof. And the chemicals come from India. India is one of those countries that has had a huge impact of the COVID-19. And as a result, a lot of their manufacturing locations have been disrupted. And even when the manufacturing location is still running, the transportation infrastructure in India of goods moving internally from manufacturing points to outbound gateways have significantly been disrupted. So the supplier in China has been impacted because they can't get the chemicals they need from the supplier in India. So a sub-level supplier to them impacts their ability to produce the volume of needs for the company that's based in the Midwest that supplies the product to consumers in the United States. And the personnel working off-site, and the point made before of the effectiveness of personnel working off-site still is a questionable issue. In reality, global and domestic travel has been lessened by as much as 85%, and in some trade lanes, 100%. However, freight is still moving, but it's moving with delays and higher costs. And we believe and anticipate that this cost increases will worsen as we get into the end of the fall and into the winter and all the way into the first quarter of 2021. We had a conversation with 9 of the big ocean freight carriers in the last 30 days, and most of them are looking at holding their price increases and continuing the rise of those things all the way to the mid part of 2021. We have over 50 clients in various business verticals located all over the United States. And in our survey, they have seen rates increase, particularly from Asia, by as much as 40 to 90% in the ocean mode, and as much as 200% in the air freight mode. We have one client that I spoke to the other day who was talking about the fact that back in February of this year, they were paying about $1.50 a kilo for air freight out of China into the Chicago market. And now they're paying as much as $9 a kilo for that same product coming out of the same places. That's a huge increase and dramatically impacts margin. We believe that one of the realities that occurs in business is that people need to travel to conduct legitimate business. It's been a model that's occurred for hundreds of years, and certainly in the last 30 years, where most of us have been involved in, is that when travel and interaction stops, that person-to-person thing, it impacts business negatively. Salespeople are learning now how to sell over the internet, okay, and procurement people are learning how to buy over the internet, and that all the bugs have not been worked out on both sides of that equation. In person defines relationship, which drives business, particularly in the global arena, major factor in sales, procurement, and supply chain. And what about all the trade association meetings that we went to find potential sources and vendors, where salespeople have the world of people who are buyers come to? From about March all the way to current, almost all of them have not occurred, not only here in the United States, but overseas. They're being run virtually, and it's out as to whether or not those virtual trade meetings have actually been successful. Some parties report to some extent they've been successful, and others say they certainly are not what they used to be, when you could shake somebody's hand, look them in the eye, and talk about their product or service between a potential buyer and seller. And unfortunately, a lot of these trade association meetings that have already been booked or moved to the first quarter, I'm starting to see a number of them are already being deferred to later in 2021 or being completely canceled in the first couple of months. So it remains to be seen how these events will happen. And for companies that sell a lot of their products, or companies that buy a lot of their products at these trade association meetings, it'll be very interesting to see how that all sorts out as we move into 2021. The impact of travel. Relationships will be defined clearly and differently. We're going to be able to learn to procure and customer service and market ourselves very differently. The concept of trust, which is such an important issue in the relationships that we have, particularly as procurement executives, supply chain executives, in our vendors and suppliers, our transportation providers, and in our customers, that foundation is going to take on a new characteristic of how it's formed and how that bond works. To survive and to grow and to prosper, we'll have to learn to be more diligent and pliable, meaning more flexible, and obviously much more creative. We need to take into consideration the liabilities associated with how your company moves forward in protecting company personnel. I have a client that's in the Baltimore area, and they were considered an essential service. So they told all their employees back in March that they had to come into work, okay? They provided a minimal level of protection for those employees, and they had a significant COVID breakout among the 25 members who were working in the warehouse, the employees. Unfortunately, one of them was not killed, or it was not, didn't die, but had an illness that is still with them as all the way from March to currently. So there's concern about a permanent disability. So this company, the employees hired an attorney, and they actually have a class action suit against the company for not providing the level of protection and forcing them to be in the environment of that warehouse during that period of time. We've now heard a few more of those cases from some of the law firms that we work with, that these things are coming in, and appreciate the fact that this is an untested, unfamiliar area in the legal community when you have this kind of circumstance and the extent of this type of pandemic. Recognizing that every person has a different tolerance and sensibility at what safe is, this needs to be a serious consideration. We know that there are some people who look at it very lackadaisical, and there are some people who are wrapped around in saran wrap as they move through their business responsibilities. And personnel working from home as a long-term strategy, that remains to be seen as well. We have to think about managing personnel from home, not only our own responsibilities, but the people who might be reporting into us, and recognizing that working from home requires a different management strategy. We believe that transparency, openness, forthright, and a straightforward approach works best. Timely and comprehensive communications. We actually make a recommendation that at least once, if not twice a day, you're having a communication with all the people who are on your team. Set up stringent accountability systems. This will determine how the effectiveness of the people working from home. And keep personnel engaged as a team as best that you can, even though they're working from home at different locations. Questions? How quickly is this pandemic going to subside? Back in April and May, when we first started talking about this, we thought that by now it would be far along, but in reality, while it has come far along, it still is a serious problem. And what about all the global markets, particularly now in Europe, where we're seeing great increases in a number of the countries that it was originally subsiding in? The impact of social unrest and the current political climate will expand or subside. I think most of us believe that once our presidential election is over next week, that things will start to quiet down, irrespective of which candidate wins. How quickly will the world lead us or follow us, is a question. How quickly will the economy recover from this? Obviously, so far as September, the numbers are starting to look good. And the continued aid provided by government. We all are conscious of the fact that our government is at a standstill right now of trying to give an additional relief package to businesses and to people. And again, hopefully after the election, we'll see that move forward so that there'll be monies available to businesses to help them with their payroll and help them run their businesses through the pandemic.
Tom, we have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, regarding employer liability, are insurance providers beginning to offer COVID-19 specific policies?
It's a great question, and the answer is unclear. We actually met 2 weeks ago with a major insurance broker as well as a major insurance company in the United States. Unfortunately, I can't divulge the names of the two companies, but they're major companies. They're located, one in the Connecticut area, one in the New York area, to ask that question and so forth. And again, it's kind of unfertile ground, the size and magnitude of this issue. And the big question really is does workers' compensation coverage extend to an employee while they're working from home, right? It was never intended to be to this grand of scale. And did the premium rates, anticipate this occurrence and so forth? And are the terms and conditions of the policies extended to cover if somebody is at their house and they fall off their kitchen chair and sprain their ankle type thing? Is that considered a workers' comp claim? So we're really into unfertile territory here. The insurance companies are clearly not providing specific coverage at this point for things related to trade disruption and the pandemic issue. The big question is whether or not the existing coverages that cover employee liability and employer liability, whether they extend to the pandemic. It's going to be something that as these cases come into the system, how the insurance companies respond, and ultimately those that end up going to the courts establishing some kind of precedence and interpretation of the policies. So right now, what I strongly recommend to most companies is they need to look at your potential vulnerabilities, look at your potential liabilities, and if you have a centralized insurance function in your company, such as a risk manager, or if in the finance department they have a controller who has that responsibility, that you're coordinating what your concerns are, trying to address the vulnerabilities and liabilities from minimizing them by operational steps that you can take at first to mitigate the circumstances, and then you'll end up seeing, if you need to see how your insurance policies will respond. So bottom of the conversation is it's really unclear as to how the insurance industry is going to respond to this. So that's why we say you need to be proactive on the operational changes and positive steps that you can do. An example is that if you are running a warehouse, and most companies in the supply chain are running some form of warehousing or distribution, you really need to make sure that your personnel are as protected as they possibly can be. Whatever is state of the art that's out there, whether it's all kinds of tests that can be done on a regular basis, the wearing of the masks, the social distancing, the wearing of gloves, even more serious protective equipment such as the plastic shields that can be used, overalls, and all kinds of things that you can. You want to maximize the protection so that you eliminate that vulnerability. And you need to make sure that the people who are working from home are doing whatever they can also to be safe and well. You need to extend the protections to the best that you can for people working in the home environment. That would be our advice. Okay, so again, we're making this point is that the outcome of the presidential election will actually have a direct impact on the supply chain. Most of us know that the President Trump has aggressively gone after a number of the countries around the world where he felt that there was either a trade imbalance or unfair trade occurring, one of those countries being China. If Trump maintains the presidency, we're going to see that whole effort towards China and particularly some other countries where we have some trade issues going on. He's going to take a much more aggressive stance because he's going to feel much more emboldened. On the other hand, if Biden wins, the rhetoric that's coming from his camp is most likely the tariffs and duties called 232 and 301 will probably go away, and he'll work very hard to try to undo the contentiousness that Trump has brought along in his presidency. And it'll remain to see which one will be ultimately provide better economic situation for us for our supply chain, depending upon who wins the election. Appreciate that business is driven by the supply chain for all business models, particularly for U.S. companies and foreign-owned companies that operate businesses here in the United States. For manufacturing here and abroad, distributed here and abroad with both a domestic and international perspective. Other things we want to think about, general impacts on the business recovery in the supply chain, is the inbound raw materials of components and parts, the manufacturing status here and abroad. I saw statistics come out on Monday showing that the manufacturing now in the United States has increased by 1.5% since the beginning of the year. We're seeing more and more manufacturing come back to the United States. We're also seeing more manufacturing leave China to either more friendly countries, to countries where we have free trade agreements, and one of those countries being Mexico, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Appreciate that the governments interfere both positively and negatively. We have to be sensitive to that. We need to be paying attention to what they're doing. Our personnel capabilities, particularly those from working from home, how they're impacted. The scenarios of how our clients are operating becomes very impactful for us. And as I mentioned before, inventory management and demand planning requires another whole skill set in being able to do it when there's such uncertainty on both sides of the equation, from our vendors and suppliers to our customers on the other side of that equation. Back in March and April, we used to make the point of how quickly will demand peak, and every month since April, we've seen the demand of consumers continue to increase, the demand of businesses increase as well, and that's what's spurring the economy along. So every month we've seen growth in the economy. The manufacturing impact and capability and bandwidth, not only here in the United States, but overseas. The carriers' impact for them to get up to speed relative to demand and supply. We all know that buyers are being cautious in terms of the volumes that they're buying from companies and their restocking of inventory. The residual impact of the 301 tariffs on goods coming out of China. The impact just of paranoia of how people respond in this particular time frame. And as it continues, we expect continued overreaction and amplification of some of the issues. And hopefully once the presidential election is over next Tuesday, things will settle down irrespective of who gets the candidacy. And I put a little caveat by saying, let's hope that there's a clear and defined winner, whoever it may be. Some things to think about on the logistics and freight side is that ocean carriers appreciate the fact that when China kind of shut down in the end of January into February, which is serving one of the biggest trade lanes in the world, Europe quickly followed. Most of the carriers pulled out of service. As a result of that, when the demand started to pick up, the supply lines just were not available. And to this point in time, while it's gotten significantly better, there still is an offset that the demand for the services is not being supplied by the carriers on the ocean freight side. As a result, we've seen an increase in the cost, as I mentioned earlier. One of the things I do want to mention is that a number of carriers are offering these fast services. We have a lot of clients that are accessing them. They're actually able now to get freight out of China to the West Coast of the United States, now coming in the 11 to 7 day period rather than the 24 to 30-day period that normally was used. This gives an option for a lot of companies that were using air freight, which has become extremely expensive, to be able to use ocean freight and move the product to the United States pretty quickly. On the air freight side, most of the airlines have converted their passenger aircraft to be able to carry freight. Most airplanes and jets are designed that way so that the seating can come out. A flat surface gets put into the plane, cargo restraining device gets put in, and the plane where they were holding passengers can now hold freight. Most of the air freight companies are chartering their aircraft, okay? But all the result of this is that pricing has gone through the roof. And as I mentioned earlier, as much as 200% more than it was earlier in the year. Truck and rail services are open in the United States, but appreciate the fact that there's delays in that service. The demand is greater than the availability as well. So costs have gone up. And then there are pockets of areas where if all of a sudden somebody in a particular warehouse of a trucking company or a 3PL gets the COVID problem, then the area shuts down. So there are disruptions all over the place that are occurring as this happens. The use of service providers, meaning custom house brokers, 3PLs, and freight forwarders, is on the increase. They become your best friend in a pandemic like this because they have access to all kinds of options in the global supply chain. Specifically as it relates to freight forwarders, custom house brokers, what we refer to as service providers, we recommend that you really look for companies that have a global reach, particularly if you're operating in the international arena, that they have expertise in supply chain disruption and mitigation, meaning they can staff up, they have access to additional resources to bring to your benefit. Understand that the world is operating at different times and different days all the time. So you need to have a company that's running 24/7, 365. They have to have an access to an array of options and contacts and resources and are trade compliant. Trade compliant is conforming to the regulations for import and export, and the government is scrutinizing activity more than they've ever had before because of all the trade that's occurring and crossing borders due to the disruption. And always want a service provider who's actually a partner in your supply chain and can support you in the process of your recovery. Specific recommendations is really to focus on the inbound and outbound out of the United States to and from Europe and China. Anticipate continued backlogs and delays, and anticipate as you do your budgeting for 2021 that freight costs continuing to rise as much as 20% to as much as 100% as you do your budgeting and planning. All global markets for imports from the United States will start again slowly, but demand will increase. We've been tracking this now since about July, and we've actually seen an increase in demand of U.S. products outbound the United States. Every month it's increased. Demand will be seen in all segments, but certainly members of all organizations, apparel, footwear, outdoor products, boarding, camping, basketball, sport, field, stream, are seeing a tremendous rise in their activity level. As manufacturing and distribution picks up and comes back to the United States, a trend that was established 2.5 years ago, it will continue again on steroids, and export growth from the United States will follow. Other things to think about: how long it will take China and now the United States and Europe and the world to get the coronavirus better under control. Many thought through the summer both Europe and the United States had under control, but that's not proving to be correct. How China will react to pricing, tariffs, negotiating position in relation to the U.S. politically and economically. The presidential election is going to have a huge impact on that. The repositioning of alternative sourcing, and particularly using Mexico and the United States. A lot of the ISM members have already taken advantage of manufacturing and distribution being placed down in Mexico in what's called the Maquiladora program. Damage to carriers service in China, the world markets, the repositioning of their assets to meet the demand. Export sales to China, Asia, and Europe which were steadily on decline, but now have actually picked up for the last 4 months. And the residual impact of China's global image in the world is going to be questioned because, as we all know, they took the hit in their city of Wuhan as where this originated from and how they handled the original communications of this pandemic to the rest of the world. Insurance and banking issues can be summarized in the area of receivables, meaning that receivables are going through the roof. Companies and people are not paying their bills and their obligations. Okay. So a lot of insurance companies who had receivable insurance are seeing more claims than they ever had. A lot more companies have reached out to buy receivable insurance. And as a result, the banking markets are much more restrictive in tightening up on the credit availability, which is one of the reasons why the government needs to intervene as quickly as they can. And hopefully after the election, they will, at offering a new relief package to businesses to help them along. Some other things that we want to think about is to watch for receivables and payables closely. Keep tight communications in all silos in our company. Conserve our inventory balances, release with discretion. Most companies work on the basis that 80% of their revenue comes in from 20% of their clients. So you don't necessarily want to evenly distribute out your product line. You may want to have a certain weight involved with the clients that represent the largest revenue flows into your organization. Seek alternative sourcing options proactively and manage tier one suppliers tightly. Generally, tier one suppliers represent 80% of our spend. That's really where we need to be focused on. Short-term strategies: question key suppliers on their sources and supply chains from their key suppliers. Get informed on government programs that might provide resources, capital, monies, relief. Conserving capital, cash, and other reliant assets. Observe and manage circumstances with employees and colleagues. Reduce vulnerabilities. Risk assessments, which is what I mentioned before, is constantly surveying your circumstances, see where your vulnerabilities exist, where threats are present, and what can be done about those, mainly from an operational perspective. And look to viable, credible, and comprehensive resources, consultants, experts, service providers. The Department of Commerce, particularly for companies that have global supply chains, is a great resource for a lot of material that they're putting out now relative to managing the issues with the pandemic. Other strategies relating to the concept of conserving and managing inventory. Demand planning systems have to be altered to deal with the issues that are at hand here and the uncertainty in there. And basically, we need to be looking at what our client needs are and having close communications with our clients and customers and what their needs are, and then the historical data to support that. Some specific strategies in terms of alternative sourcing and helping to reduce our landed cost on goods coming in, particularly from overseas, is to look at other places where we may be able to source where we're going to have a lower landed cost. Free trade agreements is a particular good choice. We have 21 of them in the United States, where if we buy something from a country overseas, there's no duty or tax on that product when it comes into the United States. Mexico, which I mentioned before, has a program called the Maquiladora, which gives a great incentives for U.S. companies to have operations either as contract manufacturers, assembly, distribution locations located in Mexico, and when the goods come through the border, they come through tax and duty free. Bonded warehouses and foreign trade zones is another area that can be used very successfully. We're now doing probably 2 to 3 foreign trade zones a month here in various places around the United States. They allow all kinds of manufacturing and distribution, manipulation of freight, deferral of taxes and duties, lower costs when the goods actually do enter the United States. It's a great program to use. Looking at your freight assessment and consolidation, the demand planning systems, and really focusing on technology that can create very flexible and pliable programs that you can use. And tariff engineering, which is a legitimate manipulation of the harmonized tariff codes on the goods that we import that can be done legitimately to lower what the duty and tariff rate would apply. Other things that we should always recommend is freight consolidation. If you've got 20 service providers, you've got 20 different trucking companies, start to look to minimize that number and bring them into a consolidation program. Try to reduce the amount of air and expedited freight services. Sometimes when we look at a company and they have 30% of their freight spend is in air and expedited services, that's usually a direct function of them not having a good, robust demand planning system. The demographics of US-based distribution hubs. We've moved a lot of companies that have had East Coast distribution facilities servicing the entire United States. We put in a secondary facility either in the Midwest or on the West Coast. An area like Reno is offering very competitive pricing and a very robust capability for taking on warehouse for distribution to West Coast customers. We suggest that you revisit all your tier one procurement contracts and see where risk can be eliminated and betterment or process improvement, and also price can be enhanced. Reduce the number of suppliers, right? Obviously, it's always good to have a diverse number, but at this particular time where you're trying to impact margin and profitability, it might be the time to really reduce the number of suppliers and centralize that function. And look for arrangements where you can arrange consignment inventories where you're not paying for the inventory you're holding until you sell it. A lot of companies are doing that very successfully. Run better RFPs. We're actually going to hold with ISM a virtual event on running better RFPs. That'll be announced probably in the next 2 weeks when we're going to do that, probably in the January, February timeframe. But you run a better RFP, you're going to get better results. Managing vendors more tightly, creating incentives for performance, having de-incentives if they don't perform. Pay structures and how you get paid. We have a lot of situations where we have a client that has a fair amount of cash available. If we put out there that we'll pay you the same day you bill us or pay you within 5 days, we want a 4 or 5, 6% consideration in the price. Managed inventories, where suppliers will manage the inventory responsibility of replenishment, making sure that you're always going to have the inventory of their product that you need, is another way of looking at this. All our stores now, our food stores and grocery stores, run on the basis of managed inventories. And look to make better contracts and better terms in how you handle all those with current suppliers as well as the new ones that you pick up. And appreciate the fact in trying to keep a smile here is, how all of us working from home are going to come through this. Are we going to be able to get through that front door, or have we been using a lot of this time to work out and get lean and mean? So what happens when the quarantine ends? Some thoughts on the business of future and supply chain is businesses, small and medium, have begun to open up this summer and now into the fall, and we expect that to continue all the way into the first quarter. Financial issues will continue to increase, particularly October through December. This has to do with receivables. It began slowly and picked up all the way through the end of September to October, but we believe that we're starting to see the signs of a full recovery going to be taking place by the end of the year. The governments of the world will be increasing their deficits dramatically to fund these economic stabilizations. What the consequence of that will be will remain to be seen. Retail will continue to struggle and e-commerce will continue to surge. USA manufacturing will continue to grow. And we may find government intervention through regulations controlling USA manufacturing and essential products and services. And what we mean there is that there are several government agencies now and certain politicians who are looking at a list of essential products that we've sourced in China that we had difficulty in bringing into the United States when we needed them, okay? That a certain percentage of that manufacturing is now going to have to be done here in the United States to decrease the vulnerability that we had back in February, March, April, and May. Most of that problem has dissipated to some extent, but the government and certain agencies have taken the position that let's prevent that vulnerability from happening again by requiring by law that a certain percentage of manufacturing has to be done here. Other things to think about is obtain clearly the priorities and direction from senior management. The senior manager has to be engaged in the process. create intense, robust communications through all the stakeholders and the vested interests to your vendors, suppliers, and with your customers. Develop this risk management mindset, constantly assessing your threats, your vulnerabilities, and where you have exposure. And remember that operational solutions generally work best. Insurance is a fallback position and needs to be considered, but operational can be done immediately and works quickly. And review every assess every component of landed cost to determine the risks and the costs involved in the opportunity for betterments. I created just a slide here so that you can see some of the elements of landed cost. And these are the things that if you can impact, then you can improve your costing model. A lot of times on procurement, we only compare the acquisition cost, but particularly when we purchase from overseas, we really need to look at all the additional line items, which sometimes can be as much as 20 to 50% of the overall cost of the items that we buy. And we need to make better decisions. I was teaching a course at one of the universities here in New York for a couple of years called Decision Science Management. And the whole class was about how do we make better business and personal decisions. And the class evolved around the concept of quantitative versus qualitative. And in this particular time, quantitative is really a better way of making a decision, which is the concept of a structured data, statistical analysis, objective conclusion, surveys, experiments, R&D, mathematical algorithms that are used as compared to the qualitative, which is really just our sensibilities, the use of common sense, okay, the concept of relationships and so forth governing how we think. While both are important in the decision-making process, at a time of pandemic, we need to rely more on the quantitative, the number side of things, a little bit more than the qualitative side. So I want to leave on a positive note, and is that though a lot of us are probably real stressed out and can't wait till this be over and get back to a normal circumstance, and most of us thought this would happen by the end of the year. Now it looks like it's going to at least last into the first quarter, is that appreciate the fact that Americans are the most resilient community on the planet. And that's not just a rhetorical statement. If you look at these things that I have in that middle of the slide, these are things that we as a country have actually survived through. A Revolutionary War where we were a small colony of less than 1 million people fighting a country of several 100 million people with the strongest army in the world. And after a few years, we won that war. We had a civil war some 50 years later where the whole country was divided, yet we came back together and better and stronger. We had a depression that tore the whole country apart in the 1930s, and we came out of that better and stronger. We had the events of Pearl Harbor where the whole west coast of the United States was exposed to invasion by the Japanese, yet we came through that better and stronger. The next three events, which I lived through, the financial crisis of 1987 and 2009, where most people thought it was the end of the United States as the biggest economy in the world, but we came through both of those events better and stronger. The events of 9/11, where it was the first time we were attacked as a nation in the last 100 years, and we came through that better and stronger. And every day and every year, as our country moves forward, we deal with hurricanes, as we have one that's hitting Louisiana as we speak, tornadoes, forest fires, and earthquakes that are devastating, but we get through them and come back better and stronger. We are survivors. We work hard. We're freedom. We have different ways of belief. We're being righteous. We have diversity in our population, and we're always moving forward, and we're always aligned and growing and prosperous. And economy is always on track right now to be back at some point in time in 2021. So I want to thank everybody for participating and listening in. I'm open for any questions that anybody has. And really, I wish you all to be well, healthy, and safe.
Oh, thank you, Tom. That was a great presentation. As I say all the time, thank you for such another informative presentation. Your forecasts have always been, especially this year, have been spot on. everything that you've told us over the last, I think, 3 times you presented for us since February, because he did started talking about all of this in early February with our particular chapter. I want to let everybody know we will be sending out a short survey and a copy of the presentation, the recording link, and a continuing education hour for this. I also want to mention that Tom will be coming back in December 9th. He touched upon it a little bit during his presentation about managing personnel working from home. Well, we're going to be doing an hour program just on that on December 9th, and Tom will be our feature speaker for that. Just a few more quick notes. Next week, we'll be doing a webinar on cost containment, and then we'll have another program on November 6th on circular supply chains. I don't see any questions in the question link, so I'm going to end the program for now. I want to thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon. And thank you, Tom.